Look around you right now. Pretty much everything you can see, touch, or buy has one single, dark, messy origin point. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack the sweeping, world-altering, and honestly, surprisingly chaotic history of oil. We'll be drawing directly from Daniel Yergin's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Prize, to understand exactly how we became so utterly dependent on this one specific resource. This brilliant source material shows exactly how a substance that was once literally used as a folk medicine somehow became the most critical commodity on planet Earth. I mean, just imagine going to the local apothecary for a headache or maybe trying to heal a wound on the back of a horse and being handed a bottle of smelly, dark liquid seeping right out of the dirt. It's kind of absurd to think about how it started versus what it became. It's the story of how that exact same foul-smelling rock oil ended up driving modern capitalism and dictating global geopolitical power. Over the next few minutes, we're going to follow this fascinating journey from its origins to its absolute omnipresence today. We'll be covering the quest for mastery, pushing back the night, the first oil boom, the rise of Standard Oil, and finally, the Hydrocarbon Society. Let's jump right into part one, the quest for mastery, and look at what oil actually represents on the world stage. Yergin's work reveals that the entire history of oil is built upon three massive interconnected pillars. First up, oil has been the central engine behind the rise of modern capitalism, quite literally birthing some of the very first and largest multinational corporations in human history. Add to that its massive role in global politics, oil and national power are just completely intertwined. And finally, it has fundamentally transformed everyday human life, creating what Yergin calls the Hydrocarbon Society. That's a modern world where our food, our homes, and our movement are entirely dictated by fossil fuels, which is a concept we'll explore pretty heavily toward the end of this explainer. To really understand the sheer power of this resource, look no further than a young Winston Churchill back in 1911. Churchill made a highly controversial, incredibly risky decision to convert the British Navy's power source from safe, secure Welsh coal to distant and largely insecure oil. It was a massive geopolitical gamble right on the eve of World War I, but the strategic benefits of speed and efficiency were just undeniable for the fleet. As Churchill put it, controlling this resource wasn't just about fuel, it literally meant global mastery. Moving on to part two, pushing back the night. Long before the World Wars and way before oil became a matter of high-stakes national security, it had to solve a very domestic mid-19th century crisis. As populations boomed during the Industrial Revolution, people desperately needed to light their homes. But imagine your only choices for artificial light were either bankrupting yourself or using something that might actually blow up your living room. On one hand, you had whale oil. High quality, sure, but the whales in the Atlantic had been systematically decimated, pushing the price to a staggering $2.50 per gallon. On the other hand, you had camphene. It was cheap, but it had a rather unfortunate, deadly tendency to just spontaneously explode in people's houses. This totally unsustainable situation perfectly sets up the massive market gap that a cheap, safe rock oil could fill. Now get this, it's wild to think that the entire global oil industry was almost derailed before it even started, all over a single, unpaid consulting bill of exactly $526.08. A group of early, eager investors had hired a distinguished Yale chemist named Benjamin Silliman to prove that rock oil could be safely distilled into an illuminant. But when those investors couldn't pay his unexpectedly high fee, Silliman actually held his own profoundly positive report hostage. He literally hid the document with a friend and skipped town, refusing to release the chemical proof until he saw his cash. That brings us to part three, the first oil boom. Once those desperate investors finally scrounged up the cash, Silliman got paid, the report was released, and the frantic, messy race for rock oil was officially on. Things moved incredibly fast once the science was settled. In 1853, a lawyer named George Bissell realizes the massive potential of rock oil. By 1855, Silliman proves it scientifically. But the big problem was supply. You obviously couldn't build a massive global industry by just skimming thin layers of oil off the tops of creeks with blankets. They needed to drill for it. Enter Edwin Drake, who, by the way, was not a real colonel. Investors just fabricated that title to impress the locals. Despite being relentlessly mocked by townsfolk who called his project Drake's Folly, and despite running completely out of money, Drake obsessively drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Finally, in August 1859, his drill dropped into a crevice and history changed forever. The Yankee has struck oil. Those were the exact words shouted by farmers rushing into Titusville. It sparked a literal gold rush. Quiet, serene Pennsylvania forests were suddenly transformed into chaotic, muddy, incredibly dangerous boomtowns almost overnight. Places like Pithole sprang out of nowhere, going from an empty field to a bustling city with 15,000 people, luxury hotels, and rampant land speculation. And yet, the boom was so wildly unstable that Pithole was completely abandoned just a year later when the local oil ran dry, turning right back into a ghost town. Now, the reason this early boom was so incredibly messy boils down to one quirky legal concept called the rule of capture. Because oil is a liquid that moves underground, the law basically stated you could pump out as much as you wanted from a well on your land, even if it actively drained the oil from beneath your neighbor's property. This legal precedent created a frantic, wildly wasteful race to pump as much oil as fast as humanly possible, completely flooding the market before the guy next door could take it all. Imagine trying to run a business where your product sells for $10 a barrel in January and by December it's essentially worthless at 10 cents, only to rocket back up to $7 a couple of years later. The absolute chaos of this early overproduction created staggering price swings. This wild volatility ruined countless early investors, but it laid the perfect groundwork for someone who despised chaos above all else and craved total uncompromising market order. This takes us to part 4. Enter Standard Oil. Out of this chaotic mud, fire, and widespread financial ruin emerged a man who was methodical to an absolute extreme, a young, sharply focused merchant from Cleveland named John D. Rockefeller. In 1865, at just 26 years old, Rockefeller secured the beginnings of his empire with a winning bid in a private office auction of exactly $72,500. He bought out his hesitant, more cautious business partner, taking total, unshared control of their Cleveland refinery. Rockefeller ever after pointed to this specific day and that single handshake as the true beginning of his unprecedented global success. Rockefeller, along with his brilliant partner Henry Flagler, looked at the utter chaos of the oil market and decided to fix it through what they simply called our plan. It wasn't just a business strategy, it was a blueprint for total domination. First, they amassed massive cash reserves, so they never had to rely on banks during industry busts. With that leverage, they negotiated secret freight rebates from the railroads, ensuring they shipped their oil far cheaper than anyone else. And ultimately, they pursued total integration, buying up the barrels, the warehouses, the tank cars, methodically combining the entire American oil trade under one massive banner, Standard Oil. But it was the drawbacks that truly made people furious. Wait, what is a drawback? It was absolutely audacious. Rockefeller negotiated deals with the railroads so that a portion of the shipping fees paid by his competitors was secretly handed straight over to Standard Oil. His rivals were literally, completely unknowingly subsidizing his own company's shipping costs every single time they sent a barrel to market. It was this kind of ruthless, inescapable efficiency that allowed Standard Oil to completely monopolize the industry. And that brings us to our final section, the Hydrocarbon Society. Standard Oil totally conquered the illumination market, successfully bringing the new light to the world. But just as the invention of the electric light bulb threatened to make kerosene completely obsolete, the subsequent invention of the internal combustion engine opened an entirely new, thoroughly modern era. Here is one of the most bizarre twists in all of history. Gasoline was initially considered an incredibly dangerous, highly flammable, and completely useless byproduct of early kerosene refining. Refiners truly didn't know what to do with it, so rather than risk explosions, they would literally sneak out and dump it into rivers at night. Yet the very substance considered toxic, unwanted waste, became the absolute lifeblood of a new global civilization. Today, we are entirely what the source material calls hydrocarbon man. Oil isn't just about gas in our cars anymore. It's the very foundation of suburbanization and how our cities are designed. It's the essential component in the massive-scale fertilizers that grow the food to feed our megacities. It provides the plastics, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals that build almost every modern convenience we touch on a daily basis. We are completely and entirely dependent on it, the whole shebang, which naturally sets the stage for a massive, defining modern clash between economic growth and environmental protection. So as we face growing global populations demanding the right to consume and thrive alongside rapidly mounting environmental crises, we are forced to ask ourselves this vital question based on the history we've unpacked today. Can we ever truly cut our umbilical cord to oil, or are we forever bound to the prize? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this gives you a whole new perspective the very next time you hear the price of a barrel of oil on the news.